Hello. Hello. I'm sorry, I'm just getting the camera fixed because actually I want you to be able to see. No, I'll come out this way. I want you to be able to see. There he is. Pilate. Pontius Pilate at my shoulder. Good morning and welcome to our fifth Lent reflection for Saturday morning. On the subject matter of Pontius Pilate. We are all Pontius Pilate's brothers and sisters. And this Saturday morning, I would like just to turn our attention to who Pontius Pilate's mates might have been, who his colleagues and friends might have been, and in particular, his friendship with Judas Iscariot, or his common cause with Judas Iscariot in the story of the betrayal of Christ, which we'll get to at the end of the week after next, in Holy Week. And in doing so, we rely, of course, on legend and myth, and because something is not literally true, it may, of course, contain a truth that is different to the way in which material truth is true, in the way that love is true, but isn't always something you can hold in your hand, unless it's a newborn baby. But if you like, there are things that we can't see or hold in our hand that we know are nevertheless true. And it's the same with myths and legends. They can teach us something that's true without necessarily being about something that actually happened. And there are lots of these myths and legends in the ancients and through to medieval times, and many of them were contained in a book I've referred to before, called The Golden Legends. The Golden Legend, singular or plural? I think it's legend. The Golden Legend, which was really a life of the saints. Do I have my glasses? No, I do. Oh, yes, I do. The Golden Legend was written by Jacobus de Varagine in the 13th century. I couldn't remember who it was last time I mentioned it. But the Golden Legend is really life of the saints, but it also wove in old legends and myths and some stories that were true, and particularly lives of saints that were true things about their lives. But it wove together the logos, which is literal truth and rational truth, and mythos, which is the other sort of truth in Greek, which is where we get the word myth from, something that reveals a deeper truth than literal material truth. Now, the reason I start by saying that is that in the Golden Legend there is a story about how Pontius Pilate, and this is sort of set in northern Europe, was looking out of his window of his palace and saw across the wall in the grounds outside his palace a beautiful orchard and a wonderful apple tree with beautiful apples on it. And he called his servant and said that he wanted those apples. He wanted him to go scrumping for him. So he dispatched him over the wall and he was filling the apples, and then the owner of the orchard, one chap called Reuben, he wasn't named in this story, but we'll come to that, shouted, "Oi, what do you think you're doing?" Like the policeman who gave the proverbial clip round the ear to the scrumping boys. Anyway, it's a bit worse than that, because this young servant boy killed the orchard owner with a stone in a sling and took the apples back to Pilate in his palace. And he told Pontius Pilate what the cost of the apples had been. And you see, it's all tied up in previous myths and legends and stories that tell us who we are, like the Adam and Eve story, like Eve being tempted by the serpent, eating the fruit of the forbidden tree, bringing death upon mankind as a result, the fall, if you like. And these are stories and myths are interwoven over time. And one of the things that story came to reveal was that servant boy was Judas Iscariot, serving Pontius Pilate, who stole the apples for him. And he told Pilate the price that the apples had exacted, the death of the orchard keeper. And it turns out in another story that Reuben, that orchard keeper, was his own father. That is Judas Iscariot's own father. Do you see where we're going with this? You see about the death of original sin, the fall of Adam, the orchard, the apple, Pontius Pilate, how these things are all being woven together in these old legends. But the Golden Legend has another way of addressing the story, and I want to read to you again an extract from our book for Lent, Pilate, the biography of an invented man by Anne Rowe, which is commended to you. I think it's in paperback now, so you can get it for about a tenner from Amazon. And I want to read you this passage because it begins to delve a bit more into the background of Pilate with Judas, and indeed Judas with Pilate. So let me read you this passage, and do bear in mind that these are myths and legends that arise out of old medieval stories that have been told again and again down the generations, some of which are compiled into Jacobus de Varegin's work, the Golden Legend, which I think I'm going to buy next, actually, because I have never acquired that book, and I gather there's a new translation of it, so I'm going to read that. But anyway, let me read you this passage from Pilate. So Pilate stood at the window, longing so deeply that he thought he would faint away, and his servant stood at his shoulder. But this was no ordinary servant. He was Pilate's deputy in this story, his soulmate, and a man who understood at a snap of the fingers the deepest inclinations of his master's heart. His name, yes, you guessed it, was Judas Iscariot. Now, medieval mythmakers believe the two men must have been thrown together some years before the betrayal of Christ. Their careers were bound to cross. There's that word, cross. Like evil twins, they needed to plot together and strengthen their complicity in each other's company. No one else would willingly be their associate, but in the gloomy halls and mountain passes where such lost souls met, they could comfort each other. Thus, in one modern Italian novel about Pilate, Judas tells him, "We are the indispensable artisans of the redemption. We are the instruments of the supreme outrage required to shake the moral conscience of the world." He's talking about the betrayal and crucifixion of Christ, of course. "You," he tells Pilate, "will be execrated, but console yourself. He knows that he could never have redeemed mankind without my pretended betrayal and your pretended cowardice." So they have a role, question, in God's plan? Hold that thought. Now, Thomas de Quincey, and Thomas de Quincey was a Victorian English essayist who was also a famous drug addict in the kind of Byron tradition. He was well known for his collection of essays, I think, called Confessions of an Opium Eater or Opium Smoker. Anyway, he liked his opium, Thomas de Quincey, and in his Opium Haze also understood this, Thomas de Quincey. "Judas," he wrote, "should never have been flung into the potter's field after his suicide on the elder tree. He had served Christ's purposes. He had been the force that had pushed him into action. Pilate had then pushed him further towards the result that God intended." Now, the Golden Legend, that's the 13th century book by Varigine to which I referred, the Golden Legend recounted how Judas's life, like Pilate's, had begun with portents, though they were more in the nature of bad dreams. One night, and this is from the Golden Legend, Reuben, his father, and Cyboria, his mother had made love and she fell into a deep sleep, only to wake up screaming. She had dreamt, she said, that she was going to have a son, quotes, so wicked that he would bring ruin to all our people. Reuben scoffed at this. He thought some divining spirit must have infected her, but she insisted through her sobs that it was not. The son she was bound to have would be a revelation of the truth. The 9 months passed and Siberia bore a son. His parents didn't know what to do with him. His little body was perfect, but he was red-haired, a sign of criminality and bewitchment. At last, feeling that they must dispose of him, they put him in a basket woven of green rushes and set him afloat on the sea. After a while, the basket drifted ashore on an island called Iscariot. The queen of the island, who was childless, was walking along the beach. She saw the basket bobbing on the surf and asked her maids to bring it to her. The child's face within the basket shone with fraudulent beauty, and the queen sighed. If only I had a child like that, she said, the royal line would be secure. Ironic, huh? So she had the child rescued and secretly put to a nurse, while she herself pretended to be pregnant. Later, amid national rejoicing, she produced Judas as her own son. In this way, though his origins were obscure, he was brought up royally, that's Judas Iscariot, as at some distance Pilate was. Do you remember the various stories we had a couple of weeks ago about where Pilate came from? Indeed, when one of those stories, he ends up in his own island, didn't he? Called the island of Pontii, or was he? No, he was from the Pontii tribe, and he was on the island of Pontius. Pilatus, that's right. That's how he got his name, anyway. So, resonance there between the stories. So he was brought up royally. Where did I get to? And in Judas's case too, there was competition that his proud nature found unbearable. Not long after the queen's false pregnancy, she gave birth to a true son conceived with the king. So Judas, like Pilate, had a brother who was by blood and breeding superior. That story of Pilate's elder brother was from that story of that, and he killed him, didn't he, and was banished, therefore, to that island, where he was eventually picked up by Herod to be taken to Jerusalem. As they grew up and played together, Judas often mistreated the royal child and made him cry. Sometimes the devil himself got into Judas, making him bite anyone who came near him. If there was no one near, he would bite his own arms and backs of his freckled hands. In despair, his mother took him at last to a child in Nazareth called Jesus, who was said to work miracles. The child touched Judas, and at once the devil slunk out of him in the shape of a black dog, a bit like Dylan. But not before Judas had bitten Jesus on the hand and the right side, which made him cry. The scar of the bite in his side later provided a marker for a half-blind centurion to pierce him on Pilate's orders. The spear in the side when he was on the cross. After the visit to Jesus, Judas was better for a time, but it didn't last. He somehow found out that he was not the queen's son, but a foundling, a piece of jetsam washed up on the beach. This filled him with such shame that he secretly killed the queen's true son and fled to Jerusalem, hiding himself in a company of young men who were being sent there as tribute. Daring to emerge, he took service in the household of Pilate, who was governor, of course. Pilate was deeply charmed by him, a strange, starred child like himself, a half-prince, a brother-killer, a tribute boy, you see, very much like Pilate. On every level they understood each other, screw to screw and false to false, as a medieval writer described it. In no time, Judas became Pilate's favourite. They walked together, drank together, laughed at each other's jokes. Pilate gave Jesus the post of chief steward, and Judas did for Pilate anything he requested. Pilate made a strange employer. He was capricious, filled with sudden longings and peculiar impulses, and each of these Judas was bound to satisfy. When he went to fetch the apples from the orchard, the man he encountered was Reuben, his own father. Unwittingly, since neither man recognized the other, Judas slew him with a stone in the nape of the neck. The governor, the bright fruit at last in his hands, barely registered the cost of the errand. When he did, after the body was discovered at dusk under the blue trees, he awarded all Reuben's goods to Judas, including Cyboria, Judas's mother. The governor, morally impervious or possibly still dreaming, seemed unaware of the enormity of what he had done. So Judas, like Oedipus, killed his father and at Pilate's urging married his mother, until the day when she suddenly burst into tears among the tangled sheets. You see how these legends and myths and old Greek stories are woven together, including the story of Oedipus. As she burst into tears among the tangled sheets. Learning the truth, Judas at first had no idea what to do, but Cyboria, his mother, saved him. She urged him to repent of his awful sin by joining Jesus and his band of disciples. Judas agreed, for as it happened, that too fitted perfectly with the schemes which he and Pilate were hatching together. For Pilate had longed for apples, the symbols of Christ. Remember that Christmas carol about the apple tree? The symbol of Christ on the tree, the apple on the tree. But this was nothing compared to his desire for Christ himself. He had heard reports of his disturbances, but also snippets of his teachings, including the idea that this man too had a royal parentage that was distant and confused. I'll say. It was impossible to make a public show of his curiosity, but repentant Iscariot could become Christ's follower and infiltrate the group of disciples on Pilate's behalf. He succeeded admirably. He became a favourite among the disciples and was trusted with the group's store of cash, not that there was much of it. So actually, Judas Iscariot, as we know from our own Gospels, was the treasurer, the purse keeper of the disciples. Of course, treasurers, particularly treasurers of PCC, can be much more virtuous than Judas Iscariot. Meanwhile, Jesus' doings were faithfully reported back to Pilate. He was a spy, you see. When those doings became too dangerous, too strange, smacking of alternative authority and insurrection and insurgency, it was Judas who was sent to Christ to turn Christ in, to jump over the wall, if you like, seize the fruit that so tortured Pilate, brush his lips against it, and bring it before him. You see how the metaphor of stealing the apple from over the wall is like turning Jesus in. He would not know, as Pilate himself did not know, whether Pilate was motivated by rage, curiosity, jealousy, cruelty, or something like love. His own role was not to ask questions. For Judas, it was to jump, fetch, deliver, feign, and fawn for and to Pilate, like any good little red-headed spy. That's the story I wanted to read from our Lent book today. And the thought that I'd like you just, or for us all really, to dwell on is this idea of Judas's servanthood. His service to Pontius Pilate and his service to Jesus. Because it raises a very interesting question, doesn't it? It was raised for me the other day by one of our congregants after church. If it wasn't for Judas and Pontius Pilate, then surely God's plan wouldn't have been able to be worked through. How would it have been if Jesus had lived to old age? Didn't the need to be the torture, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus, so that the Christ could rise and defeat death and darkness and that evil? So were Pilate and his legendary servant Judas, I mean, he did serve his purpose, we know that from the Gospels. He was a servant in that sense, in that he turned Jesus over to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver. Well, to the temple authorities, who then turned him over to Pilate. So if you like, this idea of them being part of God's plan is an interesting one, they being Pilate and Iscariot. Was this God's plan? Well, in one sense, I want to say no. Because God isn't in the business of nailing people, his people, those he loves, universally and unconditionally. He's not in the business of nailing those he loves to pieces of wood and leaving him in the burning heat to die a slow and agonizing death. So in that sense, no, this isn't God's plan. But what I want to suggest to you, that it is God's plan to work with sinners, to work with those who are alienated from God and in the dark, and transform that alienation and that darkness into something new and wonderful and reborn. And that applies to all of us. So, in a way, God worked with what this story was unfolding and showed us how, through faith and hope and sacrifice, death and darkness can be turned into something infinitely wonderful and infinitely true, not just legend or myth. Now, as I say, I think that puts us perhaps in an interesting place, because what are we doing if we put ourselves in the story? What are we doing if we put ourselves in that forum outside the Praetorium in Jerusalem, when Pilate emerges with the battered, bruised and bleeding Christ with a crown of thorns on his head and mockingly says, "Ecce homo, here is the man, the man. What do you want me to do with him now? Surely I've done enough. I've beaten him up. He's had a good seeing to. He's had a good thrashing. I've reduced him, humbled him, reduced him to being on his hands and knees, barely conscious. Here's the man, you take him." No, they cry, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." The chant is taken up. Now I've invited you to put yourself in that crowd. Are you shouting, "Crucify him," or are you shouting, "No, don't crucify him"? We can't have the privileged knowledge that we have today of the gospel and God's work in the world. So it's all very well for us to say, no, we wouldn't want to crucify him. He's our Lord and our Saviour. But if he wasn't crucified, how would we know that? So in other words, we are perhaps putting ourselves as sinners with sinners Judas Iscariot and sinner Pontius Pilate, and all the sinners gathered that day together. We're one of them. God can work with that, as he shows in our gospel story. He can work with Iscariot. He can work with what Pilate does. He can work with what we do. Now, we can't know whether Pilate or Judas Iscariot were repentant at what they'd done. I mean, we know that Judas threw the 30 pieces of silver at them, back at them, back at the temple authorities, because they wouldn't receive them back, because he was so filled with guilt when he realized what he'd done and went and hanged himself. Can God turn that into something wonderful? Well, we can't know. But we know in our own story, in our own Christian story, how he turned that darkness, the darkness of that day, the crucifixion, into something infinitely wonderful. So we can turn our darkness and our sin and us into something wonderful if we'll let him. But let's acknowledge that we're in that crowd. We're in that crowd, that baying crowd, baying for blood, trying to put Pontius Pilate right when he suggests that they release Jesus and crucify Barabbas. What are we shouting? What are we shouting? Because not only in our way are we like sinner Judas Iscariot, but we're very like Pontius Pilate. That day, in all our days, very much like brothers and sisters of Pontius Pilate. Let's leave it there for this week, and we enter Passiontide tomorrow, Passion Sunday. It's my day off. I'm having a Sunday off, but I look forward to worshipping with you. I will come either to make my communion, or I may come to the 10 o'clock, or I may come to both if the Spirit seizes me. But it'd be lovely to be part of the congregation with you at church tomorrow on Passion Sunday. Next Sunday will be Palm Sunday at St. Bart's, and we'll observe the Liturgy of the Palms. And on that Saturday, the Saturday before Palm Sunday, next Saturday, I will conclude my reflections on Pontius Pilate and us being his brothers and sisters. So tune in then, or afterwards, if you're able. I love that expression, tune in. That's what we used to do, wasn't it? With knobs on our tellies. Now we just hit buttons, as I'm going to now, as I wish you every blessing of Passiontide, and I hope to see you now and in the joy of Easter. But let's, in this Passiontide, reflect on Pontius Pilate, and in praying for him, pray for ourselves. God bless and goodbye for now. Bye.